Oh, are we on? You got to admit, that's something to be upstaged by paper mache philosophy. I want to remind you again, in a way, how life will not allow people to observe this as obvious as it is, and to remember it once that it's seen, that everything going on in life, that people are out, apparently, outside their homes, looking at a screen, at a playing field, at a stage. Some people are going for fun, some are doing it for a living. And they refer to arts, entertainment, and sports, and all sorts of ways, descriptive manners, critical manners, sociologists, psychologists, paleontologists, I don't know what they're doing there, but of making comments on the activities themselves when it's one thing going on. It is the chemical activity of their brain. For any critic, no matter what his reputation, to start making, and no matter how learned, no matter how verbose, might be his commentaries, and he would go on for pages, and he may get one of the lead articles in this month's Atlantic, or the Village Voice, or the New Yorker, just taking something either apart, or apparently reconstructing, adding to the artistic merit of whatever it was, a symphony, a painting, a play. And all he's doing is saying that his brain liked it. That's all. That's all anybody can say. Or if he, in some very erudite manner, just deconstructs the whole piece, apparently based upon historical precedent, logic, a whole lot of verbal sarcasm, of course. He's saying one thing, that he sat there, assuming they had chairs, and over a period of time, his brain chemistry did not react favorably to the stimuli. And it's no different whether it was a football game, soccer match, a new play, a symphony. It doesn't matter what it is. That's all they're saying. That's all you can say. And yet it seems, as everyone knows, all you've got to do is right quick. Assuming I might have your brain pulled slightly somewhere else, all you got to do right now is just bounce back like a good old rubber band. And you can even look off and ponder this. Some of you can smile and go, yeah, boy, that's clever. God, I like that. I bet I'm one of the few people in the world that know that. All you're doing, you think you're commenting on this information. All you're doing is saying, my brain is enjoying thinking about this. Or the stimuli coming in this case hearing it, and what little visual is going on up here. But it's going in, just like everything else. If I was doing all this in some pantomime, or if I was sending out messages attempting to through odors, it still gets into your brain, and you personally, the chemical activity of your brain either finds it enjoyable and pleasant, sniffing a little stuff, having sex, all sorts of things. You either find it pleasant or you find it unpleasant, like eating semi-cooked rutabagas, like hearing the weather forecast. That's all. And yet people would even take it further. This is all sort of a preface tonight. Not a premise. It's not even a preface. But people would believe that in fact there is a difference in that which seems to be imparted from a stage in the widest sense of the word, a podium, a playing field, a symphony hall, a speaker's platform. If it was pointed out at all or hinted, ordinary intelligence would say that there is a distinct difference between that which is instructional, educational, and that which is mere entertainment. And they're treated differently. And it's not a cultural phenomenon, it's all over the world. It's treated differently if the Greeks If the Chinese of 6,000 years ago went out somewhere and saw a play, it had to do with some historical or some tale or some just myth put on stage, or if it was some philosopher. Nowadays, if it was something all the way from someone teaching some sort of New Age cult, or if it's someone trying to teach how to make money in real estate, it is accepted, always has been, that there is a difference of what seems to be this information flow coming from a stage of some kind. If it is educational, for one thing, it's more serious. If it's entertainment, there's nothing wrong with entertainment in its time and place, but being entertained is not the same as being instructed. It's not. They divide up the world. They spend large amounts of money on the physical plants of universities. When they build on new ones, they even spend probably more money trying to find old ivy that they can paste on the building right quick so it's instantly old. But it's divided up, and you do not have professors of any note, even on semi-tenure, to show up wearing noses and glasses, walking around like Groucho Marx and making jokes. Education, instructional info is serious. You prepare yourself seriously. If you go out just to a lecture, if you're not actually enrolled in a school, if you go out to a lecture somewhere. Reincarnation, how UFOs actually killed Elvis. How to make a lot of money in the real estate market, and etc. You would take it in a different way. You would feel as though you were in a different mode than if it were after this lecture, after this presentation of some kind that was ostensibly educational. If indeed it was over and several of you said, well, let's go down, there's a bar down the street, there's a club that's got a new band. Then, to you, entertainment is something else. I'll lay on this to show, again, for those of you who can follow it, it's really no more than I said when I started this little preface, but how life continues to localize affairs up to the point that it chops up reality in such a way that you seem to be overloaded with all sorts of information that, because it is only suitable and only receivable by 3D intelligence, that is always logical, it's always reasonable. But the information gets so cut up that it's almost as though you're overwhelmed with evidence. That to say that this in some way is not true, for me to pick this out and say it is not correct on a more complex, on a more universal level, to say that there's any difference between educational information and entertaining information. The weight of everything on this planet to any just quasi-civilized person is that that's ridiculous. That each one has its own place, and each one of them are quite proper at their time and place, but it is two different things. Now it's back to me saying that whatever is going on in you, whatever feeling that is thought that I enjoy something, I approve of something, I disagree with this, I found it enlightening, I found it to be a waste of time, you're not talking about what went on. Well, it was a new piece of postmodern serial music, whether it was some kind of abstract play, that makes Penner look like that he was Shakespeare. You're not commenting on the material, you're saying that my brain chemistry did not react favorably. That's all you can say. Except, life is arranged in such a way that if indeed you're doing it for a living, or if indeed you're just saying it to a friend of yours, saying, I do not recommend you go see that play, and he says, why? And you say, I'll tell you why. And you begin, just in a rather layman's way, to pick apart the play. But all you're saying is, my brain chemistry didn't like it. You might as well be saying, last night, I tried some pot from Albania. And the guy says, well, do you recommend it? Boy, that stuff was nothing. In fact, it made me feel bad. You're saying the same thing to say the play was nothing. That music is... But it's divided up in such a way that people do not react that way to educational material. They're not critics at the academic level, because it's just another way. This is not the only reason I was trying to get you to see. Life continues through the nervous system, through man's intellect, to divide up reality into smaller and smaller local pieces, so that there is just almost insurmountable weight, just the quantity of it, that there is so much little information around in little bits and pieces, that to try and make some universal statement, to try and get people to pull together segments of local reality in such a way that they begin to see that this is not in any way, not this piece, not that piece, and all put together. All put together, if you could get two or three of them together. But even put together, you're not supposed to even sense that, hey, this still is just a piece of something else. And so by being continually chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces, it's as though it makes it harder and harder for ordinary intellect to even try and grasp any notion that this might in some way not just be academically connected, but everything going on is absolutely a continual, unheard reference to something else. And no matter what it is, including this, for you to think, some of this is just mind-boggling, some of this has changed my life. You can say that. You can attribute the information and say, I have never heard anything like that when you said so-and-so. When I thought about that, God Almighty, I have not been the same since. All you're saying is my brain chemistry. If indeed you're conveying verbally something that seems to reflect what's going on internally to you, you're not really saying much about the info. You're saying that my brain chemistry did backflips. God, that was fun. And right now I can almost, other people call it, they would say recall it. You could say I can almost repeat it because I can think about it a little bit and I still go, oh. I could use everyday terminology and conclude the preface and say, you don't find that weird? Of course, it's not weird. Plus, if you find it at all strange, just wipe it from your mind. Isn't it nice to have someone to try and suggest you do something that requires no, I repeat, no effort? Would that parents had such an ability, or priests or rabbis, or someone trying to put you on the right path could only point out those things based upon the premise that you're on the wrong path, or at least on a shady path, that you should straighten up and move right over here, and everything that they mention to do with all their kind of guarantees being that you can't find the refund counter after you're dead, but that everything that they would suggest or direct or call down the power of the gods of you should do this, if it turned out, I'm about to talk myself into it. Maybe we will start a religion, because I got it. If you can come up with a way to do it, I'll front it. That everything that you say, there's a lot of what you say that the gods won't, strike people as yes, and each and every one of them require no effort. I was trying to stop, but then I got to go back to good weightlifting philosophy about no gain, no pain, no gain. You see the problem, don't you? It's not just down in Fred's gym where it says don't spit in the floor. It's religion. It's all self-help. It's psychiatry. It's growing up. It's having people bigger than you or people that seem intent on dancing forward. It's everything they want you to do. It may sound all right, especially when they say, and they're a lot bigger, that it's for your own good, and you go, well, all right. And it always requires effort. Of course, if it didn't, here we go. That's enough of a preface. Would somebody check with Guinness and see if that will qualify as some... How about a preface for an hour and 15 minutes, and then a lecture for 15 minutes? Wipe it from your minds. Here we go. Last time we were taping, you recall one of the things that I was making noise about. I was making these sounds, and some of you, the sound waves you got in your ear. And I was talking about things being, to ordinary intelligence, so far out of proportion, so far out of scale, so far out of tempo, which I didn't go into, but when it gets that way, ordinary intelligence cannot deal with it as it appears. And I also brought in some about when organizations, when systems get too large in the ordinary sense, too routinely cumbersome, too busy, then even if they had a department, if they had some internal organization in charge of innovation, it would almost be overlooked. There could be very little attention given to it. And as I was rambling on, I pointed out that it would be like trying to turn a tank on a dime. Now you've had, I always forget, on Earth it's 12, 24, you've had 48 hours. Did anybody notice I could have used an 18-wheeler? Almost anything except a tank, because a tank will turn on a dime. Nobody thought about it? It's the one, they could build something else, but it's the one ordinarily known vehicle. Instead of me using the example of saying, well, that'd be like trying to turn an 18-wheeler, a tractor-trailer on a dime, which is impossible. Or I could just set an automobile. But to try and make a point, I could have used something. A battleship. But I used a tank. And you people do know the way the tracks run, they can stop one and keep that one going. And so a tank is the one ordinarily known vehicle, that all of you know what I'm talking about, an army, a military tank, that's the one thing that will, in fact, turn on a dime. Now I'm not going to ask whether anybody noticed, but you had 48 hours. The reason I did it, the reason I bring it up now, is I was going to try and point you verbally toward a question of valid examples. Well, let us assume, no offense to your intelligence, let's assume that when I used the example, and I was talking along about an organization getting so big, General Motors or somebody just plodding along in the everyday activity, the momentum of what they're doing is so great. The internal organization, the systems within the systems are so busy trying to stay up to date that it's hard to bring about any innovation. It'd be like trying to turn a damn tank on a dime. And I go on. Now, let's assume, no offense to your intelligence, that nobody's paid any particular attention. It just sounded right, like a tank is a huge mother. Probably weighs as much as a fully loaded some 18-wheelers. In other words, it's huge. It seems to be cumbersome. You know, cannot run on a tightrope. And so, me to say, be like trying to turn a tank on a dime, and I keep going, everybody caught. Let's assume that you were listening at the time, that you caught the intent of my example. So now I wait, and I point to you that the example is exemplary in its fallaciousness. It's the worst possible example of its type I could have picked out, because the tank is the one thing that will turn on a dime. But yet, if you didn't listen, and you weren't sitting there trying to play smart-ass, or thinking, you know, why in the hell did he pick that out? Because the tank is the one thing that will turn on a dime. Well, let's assume you just took the intent of my example. Now, the question I was going to try and get you to gaze toward is that would appear now that I point out to be an invalid example. In other words, to say, as I did, it would be as hard or as impossible as getting a tank to turn on a dime. And I kept on, so everybody took the intent of what I said. Everybody that was listening, yeah, see what you mean. So now I point out, well, no, I could use an 18-wheeler, Subaru, a Chevrolet, almost anything except a tank. Does that change what you thought you heard? Does that change the use of the example? Now, we would have to say, from any ordinary view, from any ordinary earth reasonable view, now that I pointed out, if you didn't think about it then, which there was really no need for you to, but now that I pointed out, we would have to say, would we not, if we were ordinary people, that was an invalid example. It simply is. I pointed out it is. Does that not bring up a question of what is life up to? What might you find to be the actual meaning, the actual significance, and the limits of that which passes for valid examples? In the ordinary intellectual run of things, that is the energy from life's own body running through men, coming out in the intellect, out through his tongue, people do not, as a rule, use a double-barreled term when they refer to examples as valid example, because if you're speaking and you say, for example, the tacit statement also is that your example is valid as far as you're concerned. If someone has a question or a challenge, it'll be up to them. But people do not say, well, here's what I think is a valid example. I guess sometimes they say a good example. But if you just say, well, for example, what I'm talking about, for example, and you state it, you are also stating that this is a valid example. I ask about the limits. For you people on tape out there at some other time in some other place, remember, this all sounds like words. And talking about language and paleontology and sociology and rugby and the inside workings of Hollywood and other important matters. And yet it's energy. That life is doing something, and part of what it does is dressed up. Part of what it does takes on an aura of necessity and respectability through words that seems to be now becomes manageable. But consider, now that I point out that people would, even though they don't use it ordinarily, would agree that, all right, there are valid examples and invalid examples. To wit, the one I did on you. And now I went back and pointed out that that example is not valid. That the tank will turn on a dime. So we should go back and erase the tape, or I want you to remember, don't think tank, that an organization gets so big a tank, that like a tank won't turn on a dime. Forget that, because a tank will turn on a dime, so it was an invalid example. Replace it in your mind with an 18-wheeler. So there would apparently be, as proved by this, valid examples and invalid examples. May I ask you again, what would be, forget the example I just made up, see, because all of this was a ploy for the last 48 hours to bring it up here. So forget that just for a minute, that I did that. Consider that a little parlor trick. Me trying to trick you into looking somewhere. Me trying to entice your brain chemistry to ebb and flow in ways that do not necessarily correspond to the beach of your brain. Like new eddies and undertows. But now consider, forget mine, the tank. What would be an invalid example? Everybody take a second. Well now, if I was going to speak for the ordinary parts of your nervous system, your brain, you did not necessarily have to come up with an example. You would just think it would be somebody giving me an example that wasn't correct. That the example did not fit what they were trying to prove. That would seem to be the acceptable definition. That would seem to be an acceptable range and limits of examples either being valid or invalid. But could I point out to you that to a more complex intelligence, to an intelligence that was operating on a new playing field, at a cleaned building site, a more universal view, there is not possible such a creature as an invalid example. Because whatever it was is indicative of something. The obvious being, if I got to point out, if you knew that the example was invalid that somebody made, it's still an example because it's indicative of the speaker's ignorance. But plus there's much more. I'm just taking a real easy. A kindergartner could have thrown a handful of and hit the wall with that one. But it is indicative not only of me saying of his ignorance, that he didn't know that that was an invalid example. It's not only indicative of that, it is indicative, and I'm not going to go much further, because life chops up reality so much that I'll seem to be running along behind life with a pooper scooper trying to pick up these pieces and put it together. But it's not only indicative in a crude way of the speaker's ignorance that made the invalid example, but then it should also be an example to you of something else, such as, well, why would he think that? What's possible? Because you would not be sitting there if you knew how to do this. It is not a process of you talking. It's just another kind of intelligence. But it would be an awareness that that kind of misexample, that you're suddenly aware that there's a large segment of my time and place that would say that could say that. I'm aware that that could come out as being a valid example, that might be accepted, that might be non-questionable under many circumstances. Plus it might tell you all sorts of other things, such as why they cannot predict the weather, such as why every time Macy's has a sale on bedding, it's always 40% off. It might tell you, it might indicate and be exemplary of all sorts of things. But to say that an example is invalid, boy, you got to go to a weird planet for that to be true. Well, now I don't want to make you feel bad. Most of you don't have to go anywhere. But you're talking about a real curious place that they have examples that would truly be invalid. That anybody, Gomer Pyle could say, here's an example of such and such, and it be just invalid. That not just out of hand, but with a moment of that planet's level of ordinary intelligence to consider the example and go, the only thing that's exemplary of is human stupidity. That is an invalid example. Can any of you get just a glimpse that this is again life cutting up things in such a way to believe that there are invalid examples, although you probably never use the term, but that there are examples that not only people make to you, but something seems to talk to you. Something happens, I'll make it real crudely so we can move on, that perhaps you don't think you like what you just heard about. Your brain chemistry goes, and you say to yourself, even non-verbally, there is another example of the kind of crap up with which I don't like to put. There is the kind of crap my brain chemistry reacts to negatively. You take it as being an example, again, of man's stupidity, cruelty, cupidity, your own intellect, your own thoughts. You just want to strip the skin off the example and show it to be nothing but an absolute straw man, just totally invalid. There is no such thing as an invalid example. And it's not linguistical tricks. If you try to consider a more universal view, a more complex view of what examples seem to do, ordinary people are trying to use it to prove points. And I am very inclined to point out to you in a non-caustic manner, if you can hear it, more in your chemistry, whatever the point is, it's pretty weak if it's got to be proven. And how are all points proven all the way from scientific points to social points? That is, from apparent hard reality to the softer reality. How are things proven? How is the point made? How can I describe it? By example. That's how things are proven. Back into local soft reality that I can describe everyday affairs. All of you are aware of how common it is for any speaker in any manner, in any milieu, to quote other people under almost any condition, from rabbis to rabid real estate seminar speakers, sales promotions, anybody even trying to take on the aura of being instructional as opposed to purely entertaining. You can almost count on your little watch less than 60 seconds after they're introduced that they're going to refer to somebody. They're going to quote. They're going to paraphrase. Just casual, like it just came to them, that they say, well, I'm so glad to be here. Or, as Marcus Aurelius once said, They not only quote, but what seems to be the purpose of this in the ordinary flow of life. And what does it seem to, if ordinary people, ordinary intelligence was questioned about this, what it seems to do is be an indication of how not only intelligent they are, but they are calling upon famous people as a valid example to help reinforce by saying, whatever context they use it in, that this famous person agrees with my view. Maybe dead. Most of the quotes, if you ever notice, I don't know what you want to make about this, but almost all speakers who quote, which almost all speakers do, they almost always quote the dead. Now, I don't have time to go into that, assuming there's any significance to that. They quote, and they always quote, assuming they are wired up by life to be doing something at the right time, the right place, they quote those with known scaffolding. In other words, a man delivering a speech trying to stir up interest in selling Tupperware franchises in Alabama, and he gets these crowd of people that show up for free beer and hot dogs in the sales pitch, he's going to start off, and I'd suggest to you with this crowd that he has there, he's going to start off, and as opposed to quoting perhaps Robert Benchley or Mark Twain, is more likely he's going to quote Bear Bryant, Joe Namath, George Wallace. He is going to quote someone that, assuming life, again, is wired up, which it normally is, that it has some purpose for this going on. So it's not just going to fall apart as soon as a guy stands up and says, well, I invite all you people here, and I don't know why, I got to run. And he leaves. Assuming it's going on and he's going to quote someone, he is going to quote someone with known scaffolding. He's going to quote a figure that corresponds to the scaffolding that the people have in the audience. That if it's just an ordinary in the Western world, in the United States, if you're going to make any kind of speech that even is anywhere close to political in nature, even appeals to some kind of community concern, you can just about count on if the guy's going to quote 8 or 10 people. Probably one of the first ones is going to be Abraham Lincoln. That just everybody seems to, the scaffolding in our country, to respond to, oh yeah, beyond that, any kind of imaginary political lines, the quotes that will bring out people that life knows what it's doing. Again, just trust me, it's not a matter that the speaker sat down and figured it all out. It just comes to the person. And he's got a book, famous quotes that speakers use, all those books they got, and he looks and it's all divided, and he's going to start off, and they're divided up. You've surely seen them opening quotes or opening comments to get it going. And he'll look down and he'll list what page it's on, and he'll list the author of it, and he'll look to Lincoln. Lincoln's good to start. And so he'll say a Lincoln. Then he might throw in a Bear Bryant if he is in the South. Or up north he may try to throw in a Vince Lombardi. That's a hell of a combination, Lincoln and Lombardi. But the scaffolding will bring in not just the quote, but it vibrates in the intelligence and the chemistry of the people listening, that for a man to say, well, I'm very glad to be here tonight. It's really a privilege to be here, to speak to you people. As Abraham Lincoln once said, and a little ripple goes through. The intent being that suddenly there is a kind of scaffolding that by you mentioning Abraham Lincoln, there is like a tacit indication that the term, the words Abraham Lincoln, are also kind of speaking about you. Your name was, Julio Hirschfield. And you say, if I may, like Abraham Lincoln once said, by saying that, and it has, let us assume, this positive scaffolding, this positive association with the audience, it's suddenly as though Abraham Lincoln, in a sense, the picture everyone has of the $5 bill or whatever, this heroic person, is almost as though you have this picture, there is Abraham Lincoln with a $5 bill, and it's almost as though he says, that Julio Hirschfield's a hell of a guy. It's like you and Abraham are now like on the same level, or at least you're scaffold. You're like an outbuilding. You're like a piece of unrecorded, no permit was given for you to establish it, but it's like they have built up this kind of little Julio Hirschfield kind of building right next to the Abraham Lincoln building. Well, several things I was going to try to get you to look at. This is not social commentary or satire for you people out there on tape, believe it or not. Back to the question of example. And I was going to try, as I said, to get you to see two general areas. But before I get to this one more, they are pulling in the quotes as an example. And they don't have to say it, because the guy can go through the kind of piece of little business I tried to do there for you. The man saying, well, I'm so glad to be here. It's really a joy to speak to you people. Then look off like he just thought about it and he's dragging it in when he's got it right here and he's memorizing. Or Abraham Lincoln. And then it may appear that the quote he comes up with has a little bit about, I'm so glad to be here. Of course, you know, when you look like I do, you're glad to be anywhere. Abraham didn't say that. I was trying to get out of my own example to come up with something. You know, this place sucks. I don't know what Abraham would say. No, my money back. At any rate, no matter if the quote, don't lose your place, the quote could apparently just had a verbally tenuous connection to what the guy just said. That is, he opened up and he'd only said one sentence, that I'm real glad to be here and to speak to you people. Or, as Abraham Lincoln said, even if the quote he comes up with seems to have just a vague connection to that, the point is he is using as an example. You see, the example in a sense can be verbally, literally invalid. That is, he says, well, as Abraham Lincoln would say, and he makes some comment that has nothing to do, as far as verbalization is concerned, with Julio Hirschfield being so glad to be here and speak to you people. But no one goes, wait a minute, God, is that incongruous? He says Abraham Lincoln, assuming it gets that kind of positive reaction, it's like suddenly they kind of think about you and Abraham in the same breath, if your brain breathed. But he's using it as an example. He's calling down, without it even being specifically verbal, he's calling down that Abraham agrees with my views. You don't know what his views are. I mean, it may have, say, a speech tonight by Professor Julio Hirschfield on whatever the professor wants to talk about. So your name's sure. Or maybe the title is so arcane you don't even know what he's going to speak about. But already, it's as though you want to agree with his views, because as an example, he said, for instance, for example, as Abraham Lincoln once said, and then he makes some comment about, you know, how chilly it was in the theater that night. You don't analyze in some way that this example, well, sure, that's because he had a couple of holes in him, but that wasn't the fault of the playwright. You don't in some way analyze that this is an invalid example. You take the building, that is, you take the idea, you take the example, and you take all of the scaffolding, and the example is beyond any question of it being valid or invalid. No one's nervous system, assuming that the speaker is just generally middle class, bell curve intelligent, and you are too, you're the audience. No one's nervous system goes, God, is that an invalid example? Or boy, is he stretching, why in the hell would he pull in Abraham Lincoln, trying to get us to think about Abraham Lincoln in the same thought process as him? Which, you know, I'm hip to those tricks, but Jesus, the guy could have taken time, as many things as Abraham is quoted and they got records, he could have come up with something that seemed to have more bearing on the subject. Nobody does that. Nobody says, wait a minute, Abraham Lincoln, I respect him, he was fairly intelligent, and I've read some things I like, and I don't mind the speaker pulling out quotes that add some spice to his speech. But boy, is that an invalid quote he pulled out. Because try and consider on your own, I'm not going to, I think, spell out this line much further. What is actually going on? What's going on to ordinary intelligence is what appears to be going on. What they hear is all they can hear is going on. But if that's all that's going on, I wasted my time coming here. And I don't mean tonight. You don't know the bus trip to here. We got to turn the tape over. And there's always a guy sitting next to you with a paper bag and a bottle of cheap gin, and he won't share it. The other area I wanted to point out of this quoting and pulling examples is a little, perhaps more obvious once I started, and that is the quoting of other people. We've been through some of this in another way, but the quoting of other people passes for a sign of intelligence. And nobody questions it. A man starts out talking, you don't even know who Julio Hirschfield is. If somebody drug you in, or you're just walking by, and there it was, and you could come in, you sit down and listen to the guy. But he, every several minutes, we'll be talking along, this says, as Disraeli once noted, blah, 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 blah. Then a little later, a minute later, he says, as a matter of fact, it's reputed that Liszt once said to Wagner. And the man's mind seemed to range from politicians, philosophers, composers. He even dug up some kind of quote from Picasso. This passes, nobody ever questioned, this passes for being intelligent. Quoting somebody else. Quoting lots of somebody else's. A polyglot group of somebody else's. No one would question that is a sign of intelligence. That is an educated, that is an intelligent. It's beyond education. That's simply an intelligent person. There's enough of you around now to know that there is a difference. It's not arguable, but there's a difference between that kind of literate, well-read, well-remembered, educated intelligence, and then some other kind. Some other kind. And I, for one, I'm not going to try to name it. But enough of you know that for me to point it out, and for the rest of you, and those of you who already have some notion, I was going to drag you a little further also, and point out another way in which life continues to chemically operate through man. There's another kind of intelligence besides quoting people. And even if you don't quote people, even if you're not a public speaker, you're continually quoting people. You're just more of a blatant, blind plagiarist that you don't even give credit. You don't, while you're talking to somebody, you don't say, well, as a matter of fact, as Time magazine only said this week. In the ordinary world, no room for attack. And if you were stuck somewhere having to listen to a speaker, it would probably be better if he did or she did use copious quotes of other people, based on my experience with most speakers, than if the person was just generally left to their own devices. So it's not an attack on that, but as far as that being a kind of intelligence, now it certainly shows that the person was well read, even if it's just a book of quotes, but normally they got to be more well read than that, or else they can't seem to work into the right kind of tempo. But anyway, let's assume that it shows they're well read, shows either they got a good memory, which normally they do, because nobody likes to see somebody using a whole lot of notes and having to say, and as Mark Twain once said, so you're supposed to have the kind of thing memorized and be able to go, oh yeah, well there's Mark Twain once. So it shows you got a good memory, you're well read, it shows that you're educated, and to ordinary people, out in ordinary life, it passes, it is accepted undeniably as a absolute evidence of intelligence. And of its sort, it is. It's quite decent evidence, quite acceptable. There's another kind of intelligence. Life, that is history, takes some note of this, but in a way, how life is still chemically running through man, that it takes note of it. But let me point out to you, and you'll recognize it, what it does. I'm saying history, just humanity in general. You know what I mean now when I say history, surely. Even historians refer to history says in the way that I do, so at least I haven't slaughtered that one linguistic description. But history notes that there is a kind of special intelligence periodically pops up. And it pops up the place they notice it is very specific, though. It pops up in uneducated people. Up to this time, it's always been men are the only ones that you've probably ever heard of. Muhammad. Let me go with the easy ones. Man was supposedly illiterate. It's just an accepted historical fact. Was illiterate. And according to how you read it, I'm not, as all of you know, it's not any kind of defense or even any comment on the so-called religion of Islam, but that which he supposedly, that an angel told him, and he'd come back and could just open his mouth and somebody'd sit down. A whole bunch of guys would have to take turns, and he'd just start talking. Or Jesus, if you want to try that. There seems to be very little specific note of his education, but it's not said that he was learned. He was not a recognized rabbi. He was not somebody with any credentials. All over the world, you should know this, people that apparently that is individuals did apparently have almost an observable impact on history, are all the way from illiterate to unbeknownst of any education. They do not show up, they do not proclaim, nobody around them comes out and introduces them and say, today we have with us, I know a lot of you heard of him, a guy named Moses. But first, before we bring him out, let me tell you, and they start giving his background, his credentials. And he did his undergraduate work here, or he studied with Master so-and-so, or he went off to India and he studied with... These guys just pop up, and they open their mouth, and people recognize that, wait a minute, they don't quote anybody else. Now don't jump on that like a tank does turn on a dime, because wait till I finish. I mean, if you're on intelligence, say, yeah, they do, they quote the guides. Hold up a minute. History notes that there are people who periodically pop up who have, let's just call it, a special kind of intelligence. And they're uneducated continually. Surely I don't have to make any more examples. There are small-timers all over the world. Not just in the field of academic philosophy. Don't even look there, but that which seems to be of even greater import. The great prophets, the great teachers, the great scribes of the religions all throughout India, China, Japan. They seem to be uneducated, or else there's no comment made about their education. It just doesn't even arise. They seem to be uneducated people that have an intelligence that without any doubt is different. So rather than, here's where I was going to try to get you to see how life is still wired up and flowing the chemicals through man, rather than them being able to recognize that there are genetically wired up intelligences that pop up, that the intelligence is explosive, it is more universal, it is too big in scope and proportion to their time and place, that rather than recognize that this genetically happens from time to time, they can only do one thing, the way life is now. They can only attribute it to supernatural circumstances. What else could they do at the time, especially a few hours, a few days after Muhammad dies, after Moses is gone? And it starts, assuming it's going to, and there are all kinds of small-time, unheard of Moseses and Muhammads and all that. But when that happens, and assuming that there's enough scaffolding at the time and place, it begins to have some impact at that general area, around that kind of building site. That is, that the dear departed is now taken to be something serious, something out of the ordinary. He's even recognized more as being a special kind of guy. What do they do? Do they say, does anybody ever discuss, as far as you know historically, of God, we're going to have to change the definition of mutation and take away any kind of negative connotation to the word, because this man was surely a positive mutant. That is, you know, we grew up around this guy. Do you realize that he didn't finish high school? He couldn't read and write. I mean, you guys knew that, and suddenly everybody there in the little town or that area, a lot of them went, well, yeah, we knew that. I'd just forgotten about it. I'd never thought about it anymore. I mean, the guy would say, he'd tell me stuff, and I'd listen, and it was like my brain chemistry went into tailspins. It was more fun. But now that you mentioned, you're right. Then they kind of look at each other, not just individuals, but some collection of cellular organisms known as humanity at that time. Then they kind of look like, how in the hell did that happen? And life will not allow somebody to say, well, it's quite simply. It's like sometimes life just genetically wires up. This guy, Moses, whoever it was, the dearly departed here, there's no doubt he didn't get that from a book. Why are we concerned that he was uneducated? We're educated. Did we get that? Everybody go, no. We went to the finest universities. We went everywhere between us. There's a bunch of them sitting around. We all went to the only existing universities. Did we not? Yeah. Did any of us have any idea of that kind of stuff? No, we go, no. So where does that leave you? And we grew up around here. We know what happened. The guy didn't even go to school. Life does not allow that verbal possibility to arise. Like they all look around, they realize the kind of information, that is the kind of brain chemistry changes that many of us have gone through, is still growing around here. It's kind of a ripple effect to make it simple. And then they begin to think about, how did this come about? The source. And life will not allow anybody to make, generally, any sort of specific notation that just genetically, life wires up people, and they pop up now and then, that their intelligence is not earthbound, it's not local, and it's got nothing to do with education. But people cannot, life will not allow people to see that, and so as soon as the discussion arises, it's like, what will we say about the person? Let's erect a monument, or what are we going to put on his gravestone? As soon as they start discussing, indirectly at least, about how did this come about? Exactly now that he's dead, as the critics would say, now that we have some distance, maybe perhaps now we can better appraise his work, his words. And what's the first thing that they don't know? It doesn't necessarily go through a discussion this directly and this swiftly, of course, but it's like they suddenly decide, almost on some kind of silent cue, how could he have no education, be illiterate, I mean, you know it for a fact. And plus, the part they can't really see is it wouldn't matter whether he was literate, because we are the literaries of our time and place, and we didn't know any of that. So how did this happen? Supernaturally. You have then a soft dismissal, a soft reality dismissal of a hard, frightening, hard reality one. Well, there's no doubt. In fact, they'll start saying, well, you remember sometimes he would say things about, he'd be talking about other planets or other forces. You know what he was saying? No, just change a word here and there, and suddenly these guys are talking about, the gods told me this. I'm speaking for the gods. Now we got something. Now everything's still in place. But that was not some human intelligence. That was not some human view. That was not some just as mechanically, chemically, and electrically wired up intelligence, the same as mine, just in some other way. It was not voices. It was not messages from God somewhere. It was the same kind of workings, or basically the same kind of intelligence that me and you's got. Life is not yet prepared, I can suggest to you it never will be because the game keeps changing, prepared for people to have to confront that. If for no other reason, none of you see part of the ramifications if it was, then you'd be left with stuff such as society, civilization, the institution begin to fall apart. Because think of all the people who be out of work if the question of, for instance, what causes crime? Why are some people criminals? What if the answer was the same as I'm suggesting to you, the answer of a Muhammad? No, we've come too far. No, there was some crackpots years ago. I've read about people like that. Oh, in fact, as recently as up in the 20s, there was some Austrian or somebody that said that he had made all these photographs of all these criminals throughout Europe, and he said that he could look at a photograph of a guy and tell you whether he was a criminal or not, that there was certain facial. Oh boy, no, we've come a long way. We're beyond all that. And of course, we're way beyond thousands of years ago when they were criminals, when they did something against the laws of that area. Nobody said, wait a minute, we shouldn't judge old Hector rated so harshly because I know for a fact his mother would let him go without a diaper change sometimes for hours at a time. Now, back then they said, well, are you telling me Hector did so-and-so? And they said, yeah, kill him. You know, the man, he's rat-infested in his brain. There's evil forces in him. We can't put up with that kind of crap. Nobody said, well, let's rehabilitate him, or let's talk to him, or let's get he and his mother in some kind of family therapy. But thank God we've progressed beyond that, right? That is, things are not genetically wired up to happen a certain way. So we have progressed beyond that, which I'm not saying is not progress here on this planet. As if, you know, it would do any good if I said it wasn't. It's not saying that. But notice, that same kind of, quote, progress makes people think that, yes, there have been creatures here on this planet who are parts of the gods, who are sons of the gods, daughters of the gods, who open their mouth, and they were illiterate, and they'd open their mouth, and the gods would speak through them. So you get a lot for your money. When life has a sale, when life pushes certain goods and services and you buy one of them, it's like the ultimate new car showroom. You can't say, I'd like to have, I'll take that Chrysler, but I don't want power steering. It comes with power steering. Well, I don't want power brakes. It comes with power brakes. Well, what does it come with? Everything it comes with. Yeah, well, what if I don't like it? Doesn't matter. What if I don't want it? Still doesn't matter. What if I'm not going to pay for it? You got no choice. How much time we got? A little something else regarding scale and proportion, if you remember, and tempo. There is a phenomenon, there is a universal dynamic that is not specifically known. Little pieces of it come out, but some of you probably could use some verbal, some chemical weaponry along these lines, and I was going to call it active resistance. And that's a phenomenon that is not very clearly detailed in ordinary life, and it is not this kind of ever-present D-force resistance, the defense of the status quo of everything. Because you've got a resistance. I've been through, don't make me guess how many examples of showing you that, and you should know. But whatever you try to do from walking, there's a resistance of gravity and inertia. From you saying, I think that we should do away with all examples, you'll get some resistance. And you say, all right, let's get away with all invalid examples. Ha-ha, somebody will still resist. Unless you say, let's get rid of all invalid examples, and the whole world goes. And of course, you will immediately go, like I didn't say that. Everything has resistance or it cannot live. There's got to be the resistance of atmospheric pressure for you to breathe, and so on and so on. That is the kind of, I can just call it static, passive, always present. It is always the defender of the status quo, at least from a 3D view. It's more than that, but it's always at least that. But there's a kind of active resistance that goes unnoted. And the name of this particular dynamic, if it had a tune, would go like this. That was supposed to be an arpeggio he gave me, but see, he doesn't even have a piano. Or even an arpeggio machine. It goes like this. It is a kind of active resistance. When you too hard push in a singular, inappropriate direction at inappropriate times, at inappropriate intervals, and we'll get to inappropriate now, I'm going to answer that, because that's all from whatever your view is. You push in the direction too hard, inappropriate velocity, intensity at the wrong times, and rather than getting what you were thought was the aim, you begin to get less and less of that which you desired as the outcome of this, the thing you're pushing against. You get less and less instead of more and more. And the real good part is, in the 3D world, unknowingly, you push this far enough, and not only do you get less and less, you will unknowingly begin to get the opposite of what the desired result was, what the original aim was. Nothing's wrong. It's not a mistake that humans make. So don't look for a down premise. It keeps things moving. It is a part of the growth process. Now, I'm not going into it tonight. You ought to be able to make up or follow this yourself. You can find, just on a strictly biological basis, this occurring. You can find it in the so-called food chain, the carbon cycle, weather fronts, the movements of weather. All of this happens that things apparently are going in a certain way and there's a resistance. And if one of the forces keeps pushing in such a way, not all the time, but this happens constantly just in the so-called environment, apparently out there, that pushes far enough, that's apparently trying to do one thing. It's apparently trying to rain. It's apparently trying to change the ozone mixture in the carbon cycle. There's something going, it's pushing, and it keeps pushing in a way that I'm going to say is inappropriate. The wrong time, wrong places. That is, if we establish, all right, the intent of this weather front was to cause rain. We'd have to, of course, read that into it, but you would have your own. You would have to ask yourself, all right, I'm trying to do so-and-so. I'm trying to make this person love me. I'm trying to make this person attracted to me. I keep hitting on them, and she keeps saying, you know, well, later, I can't this week. And you keep on and on and on. Like I'm going to, that's your aim. I'm trying to lay this girl. Sorry, this woman. I'm trying to make someone love me. You take your little child, you know, say you love me. Say it faster. Say it louder, damn it. You keep pushing a certain way, and there is a natural resistance of some kind. So that would be your aim. But the weather front, this high pressure, we could say the intent is to clear out the skies. Is to warm up, is to clear out the clouds around this area. A thing, if that was the intent, if weather had an intent like that. But a person, that's of course what we're speaking about, but I want you to see it happens all around you and it's unnoted. If you keep pushing vis-a-vis what would appear to be the intent, the original intent, you keep pushing at inappropriate times, keep pushing in an inappropriate direction which becomes local, that is a singular direction which will never get you exactly where you want to go, but you keep doing it, not only will you get less and less of the chance that it's going to clear up, or less and less of the chance the person is suddenly going to go, you know what, you're not the nerd I thought you were. You began to look good to me. Instead of that happening, you get less and less, and when it goes far enough, not only with this high pressure, not only clear out the skies, I'm not going to try to go into all this, but it can begin to suddenly bring on, apparently, bring on clouds and inclement weather. And you, apparently, trying to do all you can pushing against this resistance. About, oh, come on, I'm not such a bad guy. Look at me better. Think about me. Get to know me better. Instead of it having effect, the person begins to actively resist. Of course, it's not the person doing it, it's the energies in life. And not only do you begin to get less and less, that is, less and less of her even putting up with your advances. Less and less of her even finding you tolerable. It can go from that, from it started out with a kind of, let us say, rather neutral tolerance, like, well, you don't turn me on, and, you know, so call me some other time. From that, you keep pushing, and it becomes to like, quit bothering me. You know, you're a nice guy, but don't keep asking me. I'll tell you when I'm free. I'll tell you some weekend. Then you keep on, and it goes from that to, she can't stand you. Like, leave me alone, I'm gonna have you arrested. You make me sick to look at you. Part of the dance, the flow of energy in life is such that everyone gets caught in that. It goes on continually, and not just at something in some areas that I could as specifically verbalize as I just did with those examples, because it overlaps. But it continually goes that you believe that you start out after some specific aim, trying to go in a certain direction, and there's always resistance from people, from inertia, from institutions, from yourself, and you keep pushing. But it seems to be the American, the human way. You know, persevere, try again, don't give up. Which, there's of course some validity in that. But at inappropriate times for the aim, with inappropriate intensity according to your aim, at inappropriate intervals vis-a-vis what appeared to be your original intent, you keep doing that. It's not an overcoming of the resistance. It's not that you begin to make progress when it's all done at the wrong time, the wrong tempo, the wrong intensity. You're in the wrong key. You're speaking the wrong language. And if you don't recognize and you keep pushing, you don't start to overcome the resistance. Nay, nay. The resistance begins to push back, is why I call it active resistance, and it begins to overcome you, and you don't even notice. Well, you can notice that you want to put more into it, but you don't really notice, and what you don't really notice is it can start sending back. That is, the resistance has reversed the flow in a certain way, and you're now getting back in the three-dimensional sense the opposite from what it is that you intended, and you keep even pushing harder. And it can pass as though, well, I'm getting somewhere. You know, back to my crude verbal example. At least now she notices me. And some outside could say, well, the way she actually hates your guts. Yeah, but when I started, she wouldn't even give me the time of day. You know? And now she's taking out 2 peace warrants on me to keep me away from her. You know, I'm getting somewhere. The ramifications, the use that life has of this is far, far more extensive than my example of trying to make some woman not genetically wired up to find you stimulating to do so. It is on a much subtler level than that. It's everywhere. And people don't recognize it. They take it as being the pitfalls of life, bad luck, lack of talent on your part. But it is part of the churning process. It is part of the internal movements of energy in life's body. But if you personally won't use it, just the simple perseverance, fighting the good fight, pushing against the resistance, if you don't know what you're doing, which is a real tricky thing to even describe. Now, I'm not saying that you can always know what you're doing, because the resistance is no more as direct and literal coming back at you as your apparent intent was to get this done, to pursue your aim. Neither one of them are that specific. The ordinary intellect, the local intellect, must cut it up and make it sound specific, because if you don't apparently have a real specific aim in what you're doing, well, why do you keep bothering that girl? Well, what the hell do you think? Well, I'm asking, what are you, nuts? I want to sign my scrapbook. You know, there's got to be a specific aim or you wouldn't do it. And so you think there's a specific resistance. She says, well, I'm tied up with somebody else now. I'm going with somebody. The resistance is not that specific. Your aim, that which is driving you, is not that specific. It's all a matter of moving energy for purposes other than yours and hers, other than humanity's. To recognize that, happening on these subtle, continual, overlapping levels, I was just suggesting that some of you might find agreeable. Some of you might find that it's like somebody got off your foot, or at least one toe, and you weren't really sure anybody was on it. I'm not going to tell you whose foot you might suddenly see move from your foot, from your toe. No need to frighten people. I'll leave it up to you. You've got to look real fast, though. From a local three-dimensional view, let me conclude by pointing this out to you. If all you're dealing with yourself is your own run-of-the-mill, quite educated, quite sufficient, admirable, and may I say, in some cases, cute, the chemical runnings of your own three-dimensional local intellect, if that's all you've got to do, if that's all you've got to use to look, then it's not always possible for you to look into things and to tell the front from the back, to tell the beginning from the end, and especially as the human intellect likes to talk about at this level, to tell cause from effect. That's not only debated academically in the hallowed halls of philosophy, if there are such things, it permeates the workings of the human nervous system. How about this? Hold back all of your tendencies, you people on tape especially out there, to be cynical. But how about this? This is the kind of headlines you see or hear. Multinational, that's the name of the company, multinational chemicals. That's pretty long for a headline. The opening comments of a National Geographic special, which I'm sure that's the only thing you people look at on TV, that you have your channel welded to the PBS channel in your city. But it opens up, and they say something about, you just turn it on, and there's aerial shots of northeastern parts of the South American continent. And the voiceover is saying, the XYZ, or the multinational chemical corporation, earlier this year for the first time sent medical teams into such and such quadrant of the upper Amazon. And then it comes out that the natives there, these local people, to whom multinational chemical corporations sent these medical teams at their expense, it turns out that these people heretofore had not needed any medical attention until the multinational chemical company built this fertilizer plant right next door to them. Do you hear me? Stop all cynicism now, or any sarcasm. This is not a social comment or an attack on business. But at first it sounds as though it's one thing. This huge, sometimes thought of as heartless kinds of corporate entities, this one, Multinational Chemicals Inc., or Limited, sends out to the largest of their heart a chemical team to these poor, uncivilized, uneducated people up in this area of the Amazon, the upper Amazon, who had never even seen a doctor. Oh my, my. But then it turns out that they had never needed a doctor until this plant, to this company, 2 years ago, went up there and for whatever reason built a chemical plant right next door to their village. Now if you were ordinary, if it was ordinary intelligence, you could be, no, in spite of all my caveats, you could certainly be just as sarcastic, vitriolic, cynical, and those of you who are more sensibilities, I guess, maybe just a little sardonic. But you could be all of these things about, big deal. The corporation sends out these great PRs. They probably, contribute money to PBS to help fund this kind of stuff, sending out medical teams to help these poor old people, and then you find the poor old people wouldn't have been poor old people if that company hadn't already been polluting the environment and making them sick. Shocking. There is another example. Blah, blah, blah. Can I point out to you, for those that can stay away from locally dense intelligence, which a prime example of locally dense intelligence is any form of sarcasm, criticism, or to find things ironic. To get away from that is to recognize this. Forget the multinational chemical company limited. Life is the supreme, the universal, multinational, multilateral, multidimensional corporation. And don't look for some sort of example of human stupidity by saying, well, here is the International Chemical Company Limited sent out these medical teams to help the people. But then I realized the people didn't need help until this same company, prior to this, had built this plant that polluted the environment as such that it's killing off these people that now need help. Don't bother with that. Life is the ultimate game of that. That's why you can't tell when you look in with 3D intelligence, you can't tell the front from the back. You can't tell the cause from the effect. Or those of you that are really good, you can't tell the effect from the cause. But that's another story. Well, those of you who are really good, you can't tell the effect from the effect. But it's the real one. The real example is of life with the left hand diverting the attention from its right hand. It is big moves covering small moves. It is small moves covering big moves. It is small moves covering even smaller moves. But as long as you only look in one direction, as long as you'll only stand there in front of your TV and look at where they point, as long as you would only stand on the Amazon River and they say right up there is where they built the plant, or If they say, right up there is where they sent the missionaries. As long as you only look with personal 3D intelligence, linearly, as if I may quote myself, I only quote my peers. If I may paraphrase myself. Why should I? You knew what I was going to say anyway. Along one line will give no information. To find an example that supports that view is not to give additional information, it's to give less information. It is to constrict the possibility of seeing. Ordinary intelligence would say, contraire, and ordinary intelligence would say, well, even an example, if it doesn't prove everything, a valid example is superior, is more promising than an invalid example, when there is no such thing as an invalid example. They're all running along a one view. And as long as you have got the local view, your local view, no matter how well read you are, no matter how educated you are, when you look into this thing, it's like you trying to look down into life's trousers. You can't tell the front from the back. You can't tell where a pocket starts and a zipper begins. You don't know which is up, which goes down to the cuff. And any idea of cause and effect, it's a local view. And it may be valid to you at that time. It may be valid to you and a lot of people around you at that time, but it is equally invalid. There is another kind of intelligence. And it's not from information that you got from anybody. If you can ever crank up that kind of intelligence. You don't have to quote anybody. You don't have to read about it. Just think about all of the illiterates, all the uneducated people that history, who might argue with your history, that history says there was a person who changed the course of me. That is history speaking. And it turns out that the son of a gun didn't even have a high school GED, was illiterate. And I always like to be able to leave some nights on an encouraging note for all of you people who may be seeing this and are illiterate. Best wishes.